Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mr. Toby, and I'm the host of Musical Chairs, a new exciting program presented to you by Vermont Symphony Orchestra's Symphony Kids. Today, we are coming to you from the beautiful Bixby Memorial Free Library in Vergennes, Vermont. I'd like to introduce you to Library Director Catherine Haynes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Toby.
Catherine, why don't you tell me about this beautiful library that we're in today?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked about the library. It's a wonderful space, isn't it? We just love the beautiful dome. What's wonderful about it is that it's more than 100 years old. It was built and established and opened in 1912, and it's been running ever since, serving all of the population of these communities, and we're happy to be bringing it to lots of other folks as well.
Now tell me, what do kids love about libraries?
Well, there's just so many things that kids love about libraries. The first, of course, is books. You can get books to bring home, read with your family, read on your own, read under your covers. We also have story time, which is wonderful. It's every Thursday at 10:30. Miss Laura, our youth services librarian, reads books with all sorts of enthusiasm. And we have lots of other great programs too that kids just enjoy.
Thanks, Catherine. On Musical Chairs, we learn each week about the instruments that make up the symphony orchestra. But first, I'm going to ask everyone in the audience a question, and that is, who has seen a symphony orchestra? Raise your hand. Wow, I'm so happy to see that so many of you are familiar with a symphony orchestra. If you've seen a symphony orchestra, you probably know that it's a big collection of musicians playing together, all to make beautiful music. Now, a symphony orchestra is made up of what we call instrument families. Now, you might be asking yourself, what is an instrument family? Well, I'm going to ask you folks a question, and that is, what are all the different ways you can think of that you can create music? Well, let me show you a couple of them. Instruments can be plucked and also bowed. Instruments can be struck and shaken. And instruments can be played with your breath and your mouth. And just like baking a recipe, when you put all the families of instruments together, you get something unique, beautiful, and tastefully magical. Now, there are 4 main families of instruments in the orchestra. We have the string family. We have the percussion family, the brass family, and last but not least, the woodwind family. The family that we're going to learn about today is the biggest one of all in the orchestra, and that's the string family. Now, historians aren't quite sure how the string family came about, but there are a couple of theories and stories that might tell us a little bit about how humans created the string instruments. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of them. All of the instruments in the string families have similar bodies to the violin. So they look similar in shape, but they differ in size and in sound. As you can probably guess, all the instruments in the string family have, of course, strings. And today, the strings are made out of nylon, gut, and steel. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can play string instruments. One of the ways that you can play string instruments is by holding this really funny contraption called a bow. Now, as you can see, the bow is made out of horsehairs. And the way that you use the bow is by drawing it across the strings. Another way to play string instruments is with a really great technique, which is called pizzicato. What pizzicato means is that you pluck the string with your finger, like this. Say it with me, everybody. pizzicato. All right, everybody, and now to teach us more about the string family of the orchestra, we've brought on a panel of experts. These experts all perform in the Vermont Symphony Orchestra. First up, I'd like to introduce you to concertmaster Catherine, who plays the violin, and she's going to tell you all about her instrument.
Thanks, Toby, and hi, everyone. This is a violin. It is the highest member of the string family that Toby was just talking about. Here are our strings, all 4 of them. Then we have this bow. This is the bow that we use to draw across the strings. The violin has been around for about 400 years, looking pretty much just like this. It has over 50 parts on it, and I'm going to tell you about 2 of my favorite ones. This one, this light piece of wood that's sort of curvy, is called the bridge because it looks like an old-fashioned bridge. And you can see that the strings are drawn across it. And the strings, as they're drawn across it, have more tension put on them, and they make a little bit more sound that way. One of my other favorite parts is a little stick that you can't really see from the outside that is right about under here. It's a little stick about this tall, and it holds the top and the back of the violin apart, and it's sort of wedged between them pretty tightly. And that thing is called the sound post, and that post, it keeps the top and the back of the front and the back of the violin vibrating together. If that thing falls down, or if it's not there, the violin doesn't sound much different than a cup with rubber bands stretched across it. So we need that little sound post. It's pretty important. We always hold the violin on the left shoulder, and we always hold the bow in the right hand. And the bow has 2 ends, a tip and the frog. Remember that. It's weird. It's called the frog. And no matter if you're left-handed or right-handed, we always hold it on these 2 sides. Left for the violin, right for the bow. And you put it together, and it sounds a little bit like this. Okay, now let's try it together. Everybody hold up your left hand as if you have a violin in it, and hold up your right arm as if you have a bow in it. Okay, now make sure to stand up tall, and we're going to play it together. Here we go. Fun, right? Now the violin is often used to play melodies or tunes in the orchestra because we make a sound that's sort of similar to a human voice. And just like singers, we use a technique that's called vibrato, which is where we wiggle the notes around a little bit. And that is to make it even more expressive and to sound more like singing. So I will play a tune, a melody, both 2 ways, one without vibrato and one with vibrato. So here is a little tune by Brahms, first without vibrato. Now here's the same melody or tune with vibrato. See if you can hear the difference. See?
Thanks so much, Catherine. I have a question for you, and that is, I'm aware that the violin is the smallest instrument of the string family in the orchestra. So does that mean that the sound of the violin is going to be higher in pitch or lower in pitch?
Good question. That's right, because the violin is the smallest member of the string family. It's also the highest. So we can play some pretty high notes. See if you know this tune when it's way up high.
Oh my goodness, Catherine, that's such a high sound. I had no idea that violins could make such a high sound as that. Well, moving right along, we have a question from a student coming to us from Georgia, Vermont.
Hi, my name is Ethan and I am 9 years old. I am in 4th grade and I am from Georgia, Vermont. And my question is, how does it feel like to be in an orchestra?
Oh, great question. What does it feel like to play in an orchestra? I think it feels like swimming in the ocean with a big school of fish, and that school of fish has a lot of great songs to sing and stories to tell.
Thanks, Catherine. And thanks, Ethan, for your great question. Next up, we're going to learn about the viola, which is the second instrument in the string family of the orchestra. Here to teach us about the viola is our very special guest, Russell, who performs the viola in the Vermont Symphony Orchestra.
Thanks, Mr. Toby. Happy to be here with all of you today. When people see the viola, sometimes they think it's a violin, but in fact, it's a different instrument altogether. The viola is a little bit bigger than the violin, even though it's the same basic shape. So if you remember from earlier, instruments that are bigger in size tend to be lower in pitch. Some people describe the viola sound as dark, earthy, or mellow compared to the violin sound. Let's take a listen. One of the main jobs of the viola is to be the glue that holds the upper and lower string sections together. The viola can play higher up like the violins, but we can also play lower like the cellos, who you'll meet in just a bit. The viola also gets to play something called the harmony, which supports the melody. So if the violin plays something that sounds like this, the viola part might sound something like this. And if we put those together, here's what that'll sound like.
Thanks, Russell. That almost sounds like two instruments playing at once. I loved hearing those double stops. Next, we have a question from Meredith, who's a student from Essex Junction, Vermont.
Hi, I'm Meredith. I'm 9 years old. I'm from Essex Junction, and I was wondering how long you've been playing your instrument.
So I've been playing my instrument, the viola, for about 20 years, but I'll tell you a little secret. There's an awful lot of professional violists who actually started on the violin first. So I've been playing altogether for about 36 years. Between the four of us here today, gosh, I bet we must have well over 100 years of practicing and playing.
Wow, Russell, that's a lot of hours of playing. And now remember, audience at home, if you practice as much as Russell, one day you can also be as good at your instrument as Russell is at his. I have a question for you, Russell, and that is, because the viola and the violin are so similar in size, with the viola just a little bit bigger, does that mean they have the exact same parts as well?
Almost. The main difference in the parts between the violin and viola is pretty hard to see. It actually has to do with the names and the sizes of our strings. While the violin, we both have 4 strings. The violin has the E, A, D, and G string. The viola shares 3 of those strings, the A, D, G, and then we get an extra lower one, the C string. So while the viola doesn't have that high string, the E string that the violins do, we do get the lower one called the C string.
Thanks, Russell. And that makes a whole lot of sense, especially because the viola is a lower instrument than the violin. Believe it or not, folks, the violin and the viola are by far not just the only string instruments in the world. There's all kinds of string instruments of all different shapes and sizes, and many of them actually look quite a lot different than the string family of the orchestra. Now, one of my favorite instruments from around the world is called the sarangi, and that's from Nepal. The sarangi is an instrument that comes from Nepal, which is a mountainous, landlocked country in Southeast Asia. In fact, there are many Nepalese living in Vermont today. The sarangi is typically made from wood and goatskin. Believe it or not, it's carved from a single piece of wood, and the top of it is often fashioned into a beautiful bird. This bird is meant to represent the free spirit of the real birds that fly through the forest of Nepal's mountains. Unlike the violin, the sarangi is held on the knee, allowing the player's neck and throat to be free to sing along to his or her playing. Now, the sarangi is played all over the world and used in many styles of music, yet it is still an important symbol for Nepali history, mythology, and society. Wow, that's such a unique instrument. Next up, we're going to turn back to our panelists to learn about the next two instruments of the string family of the orchestra. The next instrument we're going to learn about is called the cello. And no, I didn't say jello, I said cello. Now, cello is spelled a little bit differently than it sounds, so let's spell it together, everybody. Cello, C-E-L-L-O, cello. Now everyone at home, let's do it with me. Cello, C-E-L-L-O, cello. And to tell us about the cello, I'd like to introduce you to Jonathan, who plays the cello in the Vermont Symphony Orchestra, and he's going to tell you all about the instrument he plays.
Hi, Mr. Toby. Thanks so much for having me here today. You may notice that the cello here looks quite a bit like the violin and the viola. However, it is quite a bit bigger, and so because of that, I can't hold it the same way when I play. If I were to try to hold it under my chin, it just doesn't work. It's not comfortable. So instead, I hold it sitting this way and with it resting on the ground. And it rests on a part of the cello in which we call the end pin, which comes out of the instrument and rests on the ground right here. And when I sit and hold it, the cello doesn't move around. It sits nice and still, and I can feel comfortable while I play. Does this remind you of the way we hold another instrument you may have seen today? Exactly. Very similar to the way that we hold the sarangi. So let's quickly practice how we would hold the cello. We take our left arm, come around like this with our left fingers curved a little bit, and we come around with our right arm, and then we would rest the bow on the string. The end pin here allows me to do some cool stuff with my instrument that other instruments might not be able to. One thing I can do, if a piece asks, is to twirl the cello, and I'll show you in a piece right now. Another thing I find very interesting about the cello is the way that it can play very low and also very high. So it can work with many different instruments of the orchestra. It can provide foundation to the sound, like the basses and the tuba, but it can also play very high, like the violins. And there's a piece I'm going to play for you now by a composer, Verdi, his Requiem, in which the cello plays from the very bottom of its sound way up to its top.
Jonathan. That was just gorgeous. I had no idea the cello could make such beautiful music. I have a question today from a student, Sebastian, who's coming to us from Cambridge, Vermont.
My question is, what song can you play the fastest?
That's a great question, Sebastian. When I was studying cello in school, I had a teacher who had me play scales from very slow to very fast, so I could practice for when I would play pieces that were slow and fast as well. He would have me playing only 3 notes in a bow, up to 27 or more, and the really fast notes in a slur would sound like this.
Wow, that was so fast. Thank you for showing off your fantastic skills, Jonathan. I have a question for you. Earlier, we heard from Catherine that string players can use a very special technique with their left hand called vibrato. I'm curious to know if there's a special technique that you can use to play a string instrument with the bow hand, the right hand.
That's a great question, Mr. Toby. There are many different kinds of sounds or colors that we can make with our bow, so much that we often think about our bow being like a paintbrush that can create so many different types of these what we call tone colors with our instrument. And I'm going to show you a couple different kinds of sound colors that we can create with our bow using many different bow techniques. The first one is a technique called colegno, where we actually take the stick of the bow, not the hair, and bounce it on the strings of the instrument. It gives a very percussive effect, sounding like a percussion instrument. And I'm going to demonstrate this for you from a piece called The Planets, which is all about the different planets, a way the composer Gustav Holst thought the music might be inspired by these planets. And this is from the movement called Mars. There's another way that we can bounce the bow on the string, but this way we use the hair of the bow. It creates a different sound, more like what we're used to hearing, and we can play in a way more melodically with it. And this comes from a piece by the English composer Benjamin Britten, his cello sonata. That piece I just played for you from has a lot of interesting cello sounds in it that the bow produces, so much so that I'm going to pick another part of it from the 4th movement of Britten's cello sonata to show you, I think, a very appropriate sound for this time of year, what's called ponticello. Ponticello is when you take the bow and the hair of the bow goes not in the middle of the string as we usually do, but right over the bridge, which makes a very kind of icy, glassy, and perhaps if we're thinking about Halloween, a very kind of a spooky sound like this. Since we're talking about how we can almost use the bow of the cello as a paintbrush, I thought it would be important to talk about one of what we call the impressionistic composers from France in the late 1800s, the 2 main composers being Debussy and Ravel. They both really loved to use the sound of their instruments like paint, like works of art, and they took the sounds and kind of mixed them together and almost mushed them up a little bit so things weren't quite as clear, kind of like when you mix colors together on a painting. And so Ravel wrote a string quartet where he used a lot of a technique we call tremolo, where the notes go back and forth really fast with the bow, like this. You can't really hear each note. The notes kind of mix together. And this is a little bit of tremolo from Ravel's string quartet. So since it is Halloween, and we already found our spooky ponticello sound before, I thought I would take our Twinkle Twinkle and give it a little bit of a Halloween twist. It's going to sound a little spooky, a little dark, and it goes something like this.
Woo! I'm trembling in my boots. That was so spooky. But before things get a little bit too scary, let's move on to our fourth and final instrument that we're going to be learning about today in the string family, the double bass, also known as the string bass or contrabass. Now, as we've learned today, the cello, violin, and viola all share a similar shape, but differ in size. The contrabass also has a similar shape, but it varies very much so in size, as it's a large, large instrument. Here to tell you more about the double bass is VSO's bassist, Elliot.
Mr. Toby wasn't kidding when he said the bass is big. It's about 6 feet tall, or even taller, like mine here. It's so big that we bass players need to stand up or sit on a special stool to play it. Because it's so big, it can make really low sounds. Most of the time we play simpler, lower parts than the higher strings. But sometimes we get to play the tune. A composer named Camille Saint-Saëns was so inspired by the size of the bass that he decided to write a kind of silly piece of music for us. It describes an animal. See if you can tell which one. It's called the elephant. Didn't it sound like one? Can you pretend to play the bass at home with me? Stand up and put your hands up the way you did when you played the cello. Left hand up towards our ear. Right hand wrapped around to bow the strings. This is some spooky low music about a scary mythical creature called the Firebird. Here we go. The job of the bass is to support the entire orchestra's sound with its low notes, or the bass line. It's kind of like laying a foundation to a house. The basses provide structure and support for the rest of the orchestra's playing. Without a solid groundwork set down by the basses, the rest of the players would have a hard time tuning their notes, playing together, and the orchestra would sound unbalanced. Usually, when a bass plays jazz, we just use our fingers to pluck the strings. Do you remember that funny word from earlier? Plucking the strings with your fingers is called pizzicato. It can sound something like this.
Thanks so much, Elliot, for teaching us about the bass. That was so much fun. Next up, everyone, I'd like to introduce our audience to a very special guest. I'd like everyone to meet Mia, who is a student coming to us from South Burlington. Mia is going to tell us a little bit about what it's like to be a young musician in Vermont. Welcome to the show, Mia. My first question is, how old are you?
I'm 8 years old.
Oh, fantastic, Mia. And my next question is, how long have you been playing the violin?
I've been playing the violin for 3 years.
That's absolutely fantastic. And we're so excited to hear a little bit more of you playing the violin later. But before we do, I have another couple of questions for you. The first one is, what kind of accessories do you have to play the violin?
I have my shoulder rest, and my rosin.
That's great. I'm sure those come in handy when you're practicing at home. Is there anything else that you use at home while you're practicing and playing your instrument, Mia?
I use my music stand.
Fantastic. I'm sure that comes in handy as well. Now I heard, Mia, that you have been practicing a piece to share with everybody in the audience today. I'm so excited about that. Can you tell us what piece you'll be playing for us today?
Chorus from Judas Maccabeus by Handel.
Wow, I'm so excited to hear it, and I'm sure that everyone in the audience is too. Why don't you go ahead and play it for us, Mia? Incredible performance. Everyone watching at home, let's give a round of applause for Mia for an absolute fabulous performance. Mia, that was so fantastic. I can tell that you practiced your instrument quite a bit because you're really good. And I can also tell that you just love playing music. What is it that you like the most about playing music, Mia?
Listening to the music and listening to the notes if they're wrong.
Thanks so much for that, Mia. I know that sometimes with lots of practice, we make less and less mistakes. So I can tell that you've listened to quite a few wrong notes in the past because you played such a perfect piece for our audience. My next question for you, Mia, is, do you think that our audience at home should try playing music too?
I do because I think it's really fun and it gives you something to do when you're bored.
Wow, Mia, that's absolutely fantastic. I can't thank you enough for joining us today on Musical Chairs. Let's give another round of applause for Mia. As mentioned earlier in the program, we are going to make a musical instrument made out of materials that you may have in the house. This is also a great opportunity to try and play a string instrument in case you don't have one already. So, let's grab our materials. We have our rubber bands, 4 to 6 of different lengths and sizes. We have our shoebox. And last but not least, we have our pair of scissors. Now this is very important. When using scissors, be sure to use them with adult supervision. So to begin, We take our shoebox and our scissors, and we're going to cut a hole in the shoebox. Because remember about string instruments, they all have hollowed out chambers, which make the string louder. So let's go ahead and cut that hole, just like this. It can be a hole of any size that you like. I'm going to make mine medium size. And as you can see, we've cut our hole, so we have the body of our string instrument built. Now we're going to grab our rubber bands or strings and slip them over the shoebox, just like this. Because with string instruments, the strings have to be wound tight enough in order for them to vibrate to make a sound. So I'm going to find a couple of different shapes and sizes of rubber bands, and I'm going to place them over this hole right here. And voila, everybody, we have our homemade string box that sounds a little something like this. And that's it for today's episode of Musical Chairs. I'd like to thank Bixby Memorial Free Library and Catherine Haynes for hosting us today. I'd also like to thank our panelist of string experts from the Vermont Symphony Orchestra and our young student musician, Mia Chen. Orchestral music can be so much fun, and you, yes, you, can participate. We say goodbye today with an arrangement of Vermont State song, These Green Mountains, performed by Russell, Jonathan, Catherine, and Elliot. Tune in next time for another segment of Musical Chairs. Bye, everyone.